Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Russia has recognized the independence of two regions in Ukraine, Luhansk and Donetsk, as independent and sovereign states. Then Moscow sent troops to these regions for peacekeeping purpose. So why did Russia take such actions, and what will happen next? And where will this entire situation lead? To discuss these issues and more, I'm glad to be joined by Dr. Zhao Hai, Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Pavel Felgenhauer, Russian defense analyst, Professor Jove Toker of American Graduate School in Paris, and Victor Gao Zhikai, Chair Professor of Suzhou University. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. I will start with Pavel in Moscow. So President Putin, called the move a long overdue decision. What does that mean, long overdue decision, and why is Russia doing the action now?
Well, that's, I think, what Putin said is part of the internal PR campaign to sell this decision to the Russian public. I don't think that it was overdue. Many in Russia are not very happy with it, not only with the general public. I mean, though the decision is not that unpopular, but the repercussions scare the Russian people, and in the Russian ruling class, there's also differing opinions. So Putin, as a good politician, is selling it that it was inevitable, that it was overdue, it should have been done, and that's it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Toker, I wonder, how does the West make of the whole situation, the latest development? Do people see that as a, quote-unquote invasion? Because there's a recognition to the two republics, and also Russia is sending troops for peacekeeping in that part of Ukraine.
Well, I think that the West is perplexed. There is a certain amount of confusion in the way different Western countries are trying to observe what's happening in Russia and over the Russian-Ukrainian border and around, and mainly trying to see, to anticipate, to understand, to decode what is happening in terms of Putin's own reflection, rhetorics and decisions. And there are many, in spite of what you'd hear in official communique and in perhaps some declarations of Western leaders, there are many question marks. It is clear that the situation is very serious. It is clear that we are probably speaking about a situation which does not have recent precedent. I don't know how far backwards in history we have to go in order to find a constellation which is as explosive, as dangerous as one. Some even say all the way back to 1945, or at least all the way back to the collapse of the Berlin Wall in the late 80s, without qualifications. I think that the West is asking itself and trying to mobilize the best intelligence in the physical, concrete sense of knowing what's happening in Moscow and in Kiev to some extent, and in the eastern provinces of Ukraine, and also its intelligence in the terms of analytic capacity, trying to match different elements and try to see what is it really that the Russian leader is heading towards.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, obviously, the West is trying to figure out what's going on. So, Dr. Zhao Hai, does this latest episode somehow indicating, the crisis over Ukraine is winding down, or temporary even, or is it going to lead to something more confrontational?
I think this is not the end of the Ukraine crisis, because I think throughout the last winter until today, there's an ongoing negotiation between Russia and the West. And I think the episode, the size that the Russians are taking, the actions the Russians are taking, is still part of the bargaining process that Putin and President in the West are continue to negotiate. And without a formal and clear answer from the West to guarantee some of the security concerns from Russia, I think President Putin will take further actions, and also the counteractions from the West, including the sanctions, are also ongoing. So both sides are still playing their cards with each other. So this is not the end of this crisis, and in the future, we should expect more actions, including military actions. So that's why China has declared the situation is deteriorating, and all sides need to exercise restraint.
Mm-hmm. So, Victor, the Russian side has made it very clear, NATO should just say no, basically, to Ukrainians' membership, and also probably U.S. troops, NATO troops should withdraw from countries close to Russia because of a security concern, and otherwise they would take military or technical measures, actually. I wonder, is the latest development part of that kind of response?
Well, I think what Russia and President Putin have done as far as the eastern part of Ukraine is concerned is the most important and profound geopolitical movement possibly ever since the end of the Cold War in 1991 or since the end of the Afghan war by the Soviet Union. But anyway, I think now Russia has showed its own hand. I think it speaks loudly that over my dead body for Ukraine to join NATO. So joining NATO by Ukraine will be a deal breaker as far as Russia is concerned, and it will definitely do whatever it can to prevent that from happening. And I think now that Russia has shown this hand and demonstrated its commitment, few countries in the world will be able to change President Putin's mind. I think we need to cool down and use realism and pragmatism to see what will be the eventual outcome of this crisis. I personally would advocate that Ukraine become a neutral state, recognized by the United Nations and all the stakeholders involved, because by going neutral, becoming a neutral state like Switzerland, Austria, or Sweden, Ukraine will free itself from big power rivalry and will really devote to peace and development and will be a friend of all, including both the United States as well as Russia. And that probably will be a very effective way to cool down the crisis, prevent more bloodshedding. And as far as China is concerned, China has called for calm, de-escalation, using diplomacy and dialogue to seek an acceptable solution of the crisis.
Professor Toker, is the neutrality, or prospective, say, like, let's say there's a neutrality of Ukraine. Is that idea popular among, say, European countries, with the U.S.?
No, one can't say at this point in time that this is a rather popular idea. If I understood well my colleague with his interesting input, we speak about some kind of Finlandization, as they call it in Europe, namely a status of Ukraine which would resemble to some extent the way Finland had a status during the first half of the 20th century. We know that through historical experience that did not help to keep Finland in a secure situation once the two giants at its borders, at the time, of course, it was German Nazi and Stalinian Soviet Union, were agreed. So I don't think we're still there. The thing is that if there is no solid anticipation or reliable analysis as to the long-run objectives of President Putin, even if there could be a solution or a short or medium-run solution to the punctual Ukrainian situation, let it be in the east or even all over the Ukrainian Republic, still things are not over. Because what happened over the last 24 hours is actually breach of international borders, breach of international accords, and if you wish, there is a whole, how should I say, revolutionary type situation in the sphere of international relations on European soil. And this is something we still perhaps don't grasp fully what the meaning is beyond a specific problem with perhaps a specific border or specific ethnic composition of a region and things like that. So everybody is consulting everybody in the West, and things will emerge, of course, and there will be some stabilization of the crisis situation, but will it lead to relative more sort of calm behavior? I'm not sure.
Well, Pavel, with the latest development, obviously, recognition of these two regions as a republic, independent republic, and also the presence of Russian troops in the eastern Ukraine, is the end of somehow of the maybe short-term crisis, short-term end of a crisis, or Russia will continue to negotiate with the West, because obviously the West has not agreed or responded positively to their demand. For example, no NATO membership of Ukraine and the withdrawal of NATO military infrastructure in countries close to Russia.
Well, right now we have a very serious problem on our hands, and the outcome is unclear. There can be, well, it will be more or less clear in actually several days. What happens when the Russian military take up positions on the line of control in the Donbass? Does the shelling continue, or does the shelling stop? If the shelling continues, it would be officially Russian casualties, wounded and dead Russian soldiers, and Ukrainians, and Russia may be calling in missile and bombers to attack the Ukrainians. So that's that means there could be an escalation actually in several days. Weekend or Sunday, we could go into a big war. That's one possibility. Okay. Because of course Russia is right now, the Russian military has been deployed for fighting a really big war. Or the other possibility that the fighting dies down when the Russian troops move into the line of control, that there's a more or less stable ceasefire, and we will then have at least several months, maybe 6 months, to negotiate something. Okay. If we don't negotiate really a kind of more permanent solution, at least provisional, but still permanent, like what happened in the Golan Heights when Henry Kissinger negotiated their solution in '74, something that could last. If that doesn't happen, the ceasefire, if it appears, may begin to disintegrate in, say, next summer. And then we go again into a big war. So it's a very, very, very dangerous situation, and a lot of things will be decided just right now in the coming several days.
So the pressure is on the pressure on the West is still there. But a related issue, Dr. Zhao, is a Minsk Agreement. Now, with the recognition of the two republics, basically Kyiv said that the Minsk Agreement is dead. But I think a Russian ambassador to the U.S. has said that because the two republics has been independent or de facto independent since 2014, so recognition does not change much at all. What's your point on that?
Well, I think first of all, China's position is that the Minsk Agreement is the foundation for future peace and therefore must be followed. And that's the only way out, because other than that, we're risking a full-scale war between Ukraine and Russia, maybe even larger in the region. And also, it's very difficult to find an alternative solution to the current situation. So that's number one. And number two, with the Russian station of troops in those two independent republics and recognition, and also now a treaty between Russia and those two, it's getting more difficult to implement the Minsk Agreement. And now, because Ukraine is basically saying that there's no purpose to move forward with that Minsk Agreement, that means they do not recognize that anymore. So I think right now it's more difficult to implement that, and it requires more diplomatic effort to put all sides together, sit down, and probably revise and improve on that agreement to reach a new agreement. I think but based on that Minsk agreement. So that's the only way, only option, I think, currently we have for the hope of peace. And I agree with the previous speaker that right now we're in danger of a real war that broke out very quickly and escalated very, very quickly. So right now, the de-escalation must happen on the front line between Russia and Ukraine. The problem is whether or not Zelensky government in Ukraine can control the frontier and the soldiers and different militia groups along the line. So it's very difficult at this point to figure out how to control them, how to prevent them from attacking the incoming Russian troops and prevent a situation where things are quickly getting out of control.
A dangerous situation. Victor, if you look at the response from Ukraine, the Ukrainian President Zelensky speaking at the Munich Security Conference, he basically pleaded his Western partners like, what are you waiting for? Obviously, Russian troops at the borders. There's a dangerous situation, and basically everybody is saying we will impose sanctions after the invasion. If there's no invasion, we will not do the sanctions. And now he said that it's a moment to test which country is a real partner. Do you think those countries will somehow send troops or send more aid to help Ukraine?
Well, I would say at this particular moment, what is required of Ukraine and Ukrainian leaders is pragmatism and realism. No foreign country, no NATO member states will take the risk of sending their troops to fight in Ukraine against Soviet soldiers, the United States, Russian soldiers. President Biden of the United States made it very clear the U.S. soldiers will not go to Ukraine to fight against the Russians because that will trigger a nuclear war that will lead to Armageddon. So President Zelensky probably really overestimates himself and underestimates the commitment on the part of the Russian government and President Putin to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. Now, recently, Ukrainian leaders demanded that they join European civilization, as if Russia and countries close to Russia are not civilized countries. This served as a great insult to President Putin and the Russian people. So I would say if you are a politician, as the leader of a country, you need to be very circumspect and very careful in what you say and what you communicate to the others. At this particular moment, begging Western countries to send troops to fight against the Russians in Ukraine or ask them to impose sanctions before the Russians take a move against Ukraine is not only premature, but also very unrealistic. And I think Ukraine really need to demonstrate statesmanship, courage, audacity, and vision going forward.
Probably. But let's also, this is the hot topic. There's a lot of discussion. Let's take a look at the social media to see what people are, probably sharing their questions or sharing their comments on the social media like Twitter. We have one here. Okay. So, is the Professor Toker? There's a comment here or question. Is the option of NATO membership for Ukraine really any benefit to its security, or rather a threat to peace in Eastern Europe? What if it be taken off the table now? Obviously, this is not the priority right now, Professor Toker. But do you think somehow the West gave Ukraine a false hope of NATO membership or EU membership, and then there's a lot of empty talk about standing with the Ukrainians?
No, there is for sure a large amount and a rich vocabulary of solidarity with the Ukrainian administration and with President Zelensky. However, it is untrue to claim that the Ukrainian government or the actual president had commitments or even weak commitments on the part of Western allies, to start with the United States, but also Germany, but also France and also Great Britain, regarding a practical implementation of that idea, according to which Ukraine may become member of the NATO alliance. That's just untrue. And it is known to whoever deals with this issue. Now, the problem, if you wish, in terms of geometry of this moment in the crisis is that actually, at least according to me, none of the protagonists have really good options to choose from. The Russian side has more options, significantly more options than the West in terms of what President Putin can decide, because his military capabilities are, of course, well more developed, because many of the energies which had given birth to this crisis are in a way within the mind and the sense of analysis of Moscow. The West has less options. All of them are mediocre to bad. According to me, the options in front of President Putin's vision are also bad. But naturally, of course, he does not think so. And in a way, there is some coherence in what he had expressed, at least over the last 10 years, not just these last few months of the crisis, but starting last decade, even the decade before, in terms of his overall vision of that catastrophe of the collapse of the Soviet Union and being the most significant catastrophe of the 20th century, which should be repaired. So we're speaking about unequal types of challenges, on one hand, on the Russian side, and on the other side, on all Western partners, let them be European or NATO as an alliance or the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's continue to take another look at other comments on the Ukrainian situation now. Here's one. Pavel, here's one for you probably. Putin has largely failed in the grand scheme of things, bringing Ukraine back under the Russian sphere of influence. Instead, he pushed it further away, unified his opponents, and re-energized NATO. The U.S. conducted a very clever strategy by saying to Russia, no fear, go for it. So, Pavel, Russia somehow has pushed the Ukraine further away from its influence?
Well, in the public opinion polls are true, that's most likely so. When this crisis began in 2014, there were a minority wanted to join NATO, and now it's more of a majority, though of course there's a large sizable part, at least 20% of the Ukrainian population, who kind of support Russia. Mm-hmm. And would maybe be glad to return to the Russian fold, but they are also a minority. And the Ukrainian society now, a large part of it is very belligerent, and they'll be ready to fight against very high odds to fight a prolonged war with Russia. And, well, they do have some chances, well, because Russia, of course, is a nuclear power, but it's not going to ever use nuclear power against Ukraine. So this could develop into a very nasty confrontation and a lasting confrontation. There are different positions in Ukraine, different positions in Moscow, and this could lead to a prolonged confrontation that's going to be with always the threat of it escalating in an all-European or even into a global war somehow. And of course, Western soldiers will not go to fight in Ukraine, but say some volunteers, say from Poland or other places, can go. And maybe even not many of them. Mm-hmm. So this is may develop into something that we will be hard to control from Moscow or from Brussels or from Washington. We're looking into a very bleak future.
But, I mean, here's a question. How likely is it, in the worst scenario, Pavel, how likely is it for Russia to really, invade, say, to have a full-scale war against Ukraine, which is a large country?
Well, if there's a continued fighting in the Donbass involving officially Russian soldiers, if we're beginning to get body bags, so to say, and wounded young Russian soldiers who are wounded in fighting the Ukrainians, I believe that the possibility of further escalation is almost inevitable.
Mm-hmm. Professor Toker, as this one commentator made this comments on Twitter, he said NATO is being re-energized because of the Ukraine situation. Is that true?
Yes, yes, I think that this is true. Remember, just 2 years ago, hardly 2 years ago, French President Macron, who is now the rotating president of the entire Council of 27 members of the European Union, provoked NATO members in giving an interview to the Financial Times describing NATO being in sort of a cerebral death, because it doesn't have a common objective, it doesn't operate in a very coordinated way, etc. Look at the situation now. Look at the level of unity amongst NATO members and EU members. So, of course, this is one of the first rules. If there is a significant pressure coming from outside, from a common adversary, if not enemy, then of course you do something in order to consolidate the cohesion of the organization itself. And even it is going to define clear objectives in terms of the visions and sights of NATO members. What should they be concentrating on? Where the danger is. In a way, President Putin is defining the danger, among other things, for the sake of NATO cohesion.
Okay, so Dr. Dohai, now with NATO re-energized, now also you have Russia, which is seeking to ensure its national security. Probably they will not end their action until there is a secure environment, let's say. So somehow we are going to see a long-term tension probably between NATO, between US and Russia.
I think right now there's a talk about the return of the Cold War or a mini Cold War to Europe, and I think we have to differentiate. On the one hand, yes, there's the re-energize of NATO against a Russia sort of remilitarization of that part of Europe. However, I think there are differences among NATO countries of how to deal with Russia and how to answer to Russia's request for more security. And on that, I think across the Atlantic, there are different views. And right now, I think the fundamental problem is there are two conflicting visions of Europe. One is based on a relic of NATO, like a Cold War relic legacy that continue to exist, and including and moving more east towards the Russian border. And on the other hand, there's a vision, or on the Russian side, of a multipolar world where it needs to secure more of its nearby space. So I think at the end of the day, the two will clash with each other, and we need to find a common ground between the two so that peace can be secured. Otherwise, this situation will continue to brew, and somehow it's going to get out of hands.
Victor, about 1 minute, what's your prediction? Probably, look at the situation in European country, in European land, let's say between Russia, NATO, Russia, US. Will the tension continue or even escalate?
I think the tension will deteriorate, and clashes will happen between the Russian-controlled two regions in East Ukraine and the rest of Ukraine. And then the fact that the United States or Western countries are sending ammunition and mercenaries to Ukraine to fight against the Russians is another possibility for a major explosion. But in the longer term, Russia will prevail in this struggle against Ukraine, that's for sure.
Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.